Welcome to a new episode of the Computomics podcast. We have another great guest today. He's a global strategist for consumer foods at Rabobank, and he and the team publish research that is relevant to food companies worldwide. In addition, he's also the host of the Consumer Foods to Go podcast series. Cyrille Filott, welcome to the Computomics podcast.
Yeah, great. Well, great to be on. Thank you.
We love to have you. Cyrille, I introduced you as a global strategist for consumer foods. What does that mean specifically for your role at Rabobank?
Wow, that's it. That's it. So when people ask me this question, outsiders, right? I always say I'm a storyteller. And there's a lot of background behind that. So let's start with where I work, and that's Rabobank. So Rabobank is a leading food and agribusiness bank in the world. So outside of the Netherlands, we only are involved with the food and agribusiness supply chain, whether it's farmers to food processing companies. So that's the first point. The second point there is that within Rabobank, we have an insights group, of which I'm part, who provide insights to the clients of Rabobank. And there are 70 of us, and I'm heading the consumer team there. So we're focusing very much on the trends in consumers, in food retail, in food service, you name it. And we do this indeed through reports. But, and this is where the storytelling part comes in, I like to be on stage. I like to be in boardrooms. So we get invited quite a lot in the past, a bit more than now, unfortunately, because of COVID. But we are really, sharing out stories, providing the outside-in view to the client base of Rabobank. So, and that's where the storytelling part comes in, right? That's what I do.
Great. Sounds like an amazing time that you're having, even though now I assume it's more Zoom meetings than boardrooms
yes,
where you get to.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to travel again, and for the audience, we're recording this on the 22nd of December. Sorry, I have a podcast, so I know that you occasionally have to timestamp your podcast. But so in the second half of 2021, I did travel a bit and did meet executives again, but most of it is indeed through Teams or Zoom.
Mm-hmm. And in these talks, you said you're a storyteller. So if we imagine now we're in such a board meeting, what would be a story that you've maybe told recently?
Yeah, so let me use as an example a presentation that I gave to a CEO and a COO of a large food company in Spain. I can't share the details, of course, on this podcast, but what I tend to do is give the outside-in view on their business. So what are the key things? That's a bit of a vague word, but still, things that the CEO need to think about when doing their strategic planning. And there's quite a few topics currently to think about. But what I did in that particular presentation, I focused on 3, which is on the short term, inflation. And again, I said we were recording this at the end of December of 2021. The big headline story in the new year will be food inflation. No shadow of a doubt. So we talked about how they, as a food processor, are going to increase prices towards the retailers and all that. And we can go into that later during this podcast if you're interested. The second story, which is a more midterm story, is how do you serve your consumers in the future? Because the COVID pandemic has led to a shift in consumer behavior in terms of purchasing. So in the past, 95% of all groceries, of all food would be bought in a supermarket, 5% online or in other places. And I'm discounting here food service, by the way. That has changed. And we are now buying our food products online more and more. Depends a bit on the country where you are. Germany is quite a bit behind, I must say. But in other countries now, 10% of grocery shopping is done online. And then there's direct to consumer. So not even through a platform, but really direct shipped to you. So the big challenge for food companies, how do you cater to all these consumers through all these channels? So that's the second one. Also happy to go deeper into it if you are interested. The third one is the real long-term story, and that is and this is a 2021 story, but it's really for the next 5 to 10 years. Scope 3 emissions is the key sort of phrase here. So one step back. Emissions in general need to come down. Clear to everybody, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at a food retailer or a food processing company and look at their emissions, only a sliver, so around 5% or so or less, is because of their own business, which is their own electricity use, the own refrigeration, the own use of materials. So 95% is of the emissions are related to the products sold through a supermarket or products that are coming into a factory and that are transformed into a food product. The world is aiming to get to net zero by, let's say, 2050. So, but for these food retailers or food companies, 95% of the emissions that they are responsible for are not in their direct control.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're up in the supply chain. This is the biggest story. This is a long-term story. This is because how do you change your supply chain? How do you change your packaging? How do you change farming practices? How do you change logistics? We did a podcast on this on the Consumer Foods to Go podcast. I can talk for hours about it, how complicated that is. And so that is what we're currently discussing in boardrooms, as in from short-term issues and how do you deal with inflation and the current supply-demand imbalance that you see for containers, and you name the products that you have, up until the really long-term view, as in how do you get to net zero?
Yeah, I mean that's in a way you're mirroring the challenges that the companies are facing, because you also have to look at kind of what are we dealing with right now, what is like the hot topic, hot button issue right this minute, and maybe within the next few months, but then also have this years and years in advance, this long-term look as well. So I think it would be interesting to go into a little more in depth into all of these main points.
Sure.
You've named food inflation as the hot topic at the moment,
Absolutely.
The shift in behavior and the long-term story of reducing emissions. So if we look at food inflation, what would you say, what are you like, how are you looking to tackle that at the moment? or like, what advice are you giving? I mean, you are about strategic advice.
We are about, technically we are not allowed to name it advice, but we are to kickstart the discussion, regulator stuff. Let's not go into that. So let's first discuss the causes of what we see. And inflation is the result. So the prices that are going up, the inflation is the result actually of supply-demand imbalances that we're seeing. So outside of my world, the food and agri world, think about the structural shortage that we currently see in computer chips, right? The car production is down, and that's the most famous example. Mm-hmm. This has been driven by a surge in demand. Consumers across the globe, but especially in the US and Europe, still have a sufficient amount of money, and they weren't able to spend it on services. So they spend it on goods. Mm-hmm. So there's suddenly a rush of goods. On the supply side, we've seen, because of COVID, some disruptions in factories and all that. So you've seen an imbalance. So, and for example, the Chinese have been very strict on exporting stuff, and their harbors have been very, very tight in terms of letting goods out and checks on COVID. So that's one driver there where you see a true supply-demand imbalance. The other one that we've seen, which is not related to the product itself, but I think is a very important one, is labor. We have seen the great retirement. Many people have retired. Many people have switched sectors. And especially in the lower earning jobs, which is manufacturing jobs or working in a restaurant, these people are gone. And so this has all led to higher prices. And let's not even talk about energy prices, which is a very hot topic, which is also higher. So as a result of which, the supply demand and imbalance prices have gone up. Food manufacturers had to pay more for the goods coming in, and they are now going to increase the prices towards the retailers. That's happening right now. When you do your shopping when you did it in August, you probably paid less than you do currently in December. Next year, you will pay a lot more for your food. Really, that's there's a warning here. It will become
listeners
much more
beware. You've been warned now.
No, it really becomes more expensive because of there's a gradual process of increasing these prices through the value chain. It doesn't happen instantly. It is incredibly difficult to say and you mentioned advice to give. But so there's two main things to monitor, and then I'll get to sort of a bit of an advice part. Next year, I think some of the supply-demand imbalances that we're seeing might just go away to a degree, hopefully, as in the Chinese might open up, or production get adjusted to the increase in demand that we've seen also for some products. The initial shock is definitely going to be gone. So that's the good news. However, geopolitics is incredibly unpredictable. So what if, and again, we're recording this at the end of December, but what if Russia would invade Ukraine? What will happen to natural gas prices? Who knows? What if China is going to enter Taiwan? That's always a possibility. What's happening in the US? So geopolitics, however unpredictable they are going to be a major driver in, potentially creating more supply-demand imbalances. So that's number one. Number two is labor, which is probably a very difficult one to solve, especially from a European point of view, where migrant workers, apart from the great retirement, migrant workers have moved back to the east of Europe and are unlikely to come back. So this is a structural change that you see, and where companies have to pay more for labor. So the bit of advice, and again, I can't call it advice, but the point that we're discussing with Rabobank clients is, what can you do? So on the labor side, automation is one, more machines, which is perhaps a nasty thing to say, but that's perhaps the only way to get your manufacturing going on. The second one is to think about your supply chain in a different way. And so many companies worked in a just-in-time fashion, as in, okay, I'm going to produce this now, so I will have the wheat or sugar or whatever commodity coming in, 30 minutes beforehand. I can work on it, and then I'll ship it immediately to the retailer, who sells it within the next day or two. We think that you have to think differently and move to a just-in-case environment, instead of just in time, so that you just build more inventory to be sure that, whatever disruption we were seeing, whether it's geopolitical, labor related, you name it, everything that I mentioned before, that you're ready for it and that you have inventory to do. So perhaps a bit of a long-winded answer on this one, but it is a fundamental it's a fundamental challenge that food companies are facing. And they need to think, well, we believe they need to think differently, structurally differently, about the way that they source that product and think about the supply chain.
I mean, that also leads me to think about, because you said, the labor issue, machines will become more important. Where do you see the role of new tech in advancing the food tech industry, like, AI, machine learning, not just mechanical machines?
This is going, so we're going to combine a few topics here. Demand planning, for example, is a hot topic in food in the last 2 years, where we see a lot of artificial intelligence companies arise and start working with algorithms to better prepare demand as in production, which also helps then on the front end in getting your supply in. That doesn't necessarily work in times where products may not be available, as we saw this year. But so that's why I mentioned before that you need to move from just in time to just in case. But in a more normalized environment, this is becoming a very important. In general, this will help around planning for supply and demand. Let me add to that. And this is the long-term topic that I talked about, the scope 3 emissions, the climate change. We believe as a bank that that the supply chain needs to be much more connected, because what a farmer is doing has impact on the retailer. As I said, 95% of the emissions are not in the direct control of the retailer, but it may happen at the farm level. So what you need to have is knowledge exchange from the farmer up to the retailer. You need data exchange, because what is the emissions actually at the farm level, and the product is being transformed along the supply chain to get to the retailer. But the retailer needs to know what the emissions are at the end. So data is going to be incredibly important. And the third element, and that's where we as a bank come in, of course, is investments need to happen to reduce emissions. You need different equipment, different farming practices, different processing facilities. And that's why you need financing it. So knowledge exchange, data exchange, and financial solutions are the three ones here. Where on the data side, a lot needs to happen. So I'm not sure whether it is truly artificial intelligence, but at least making that connection in the supply chain happening is going to be a major theme in the next few years.
Mm-hmm. I mean, now, and I do like this kind of organic shifting between those major themes that you kind of identified at the beginning so helpfully. One big one was also the shift in behavior, which is the one you didn't go into detail now. That's something I'm really interested in, because it's not just, or even before the pandemic, let's say, we've seen a shift in behavior. At least I can speak for my kind of local community here in Germany, in Tübingen. Very green. People some have bought more online, but a lot of people were looking to buy more locally. How do you see, like, or what would you say is maybe besides the online buying, the change in consumer behavior that has had the biggest impact?
Yeah, so a sense of community we've seen during the pandemic and even before the pandemic. So local is for some consumers a theme, especially the more affluent, as in if you have money to spend, people are more willing to spend it when where they have the sort of the provenance, if you know that English word, which is basically understanding where it comes from, the product, and which could be much more local. So that has been and will be an important trend. Also linking this to climate change. Locally grown product may just, not always, but may just have a lower carbon footprint than product that comes from afar. So that could be another trigger for the consumer to go and buy locally. The other thing we've noticed, and also in Germany, by the way, is, and this goes back to the online story. We've moved. So one step back. 20 years ago, people would do their grocery shopping at a supermarket. Then in some countries, you saw some online shopping happening, delivery or click and collect at the supermarket. In the last few years, but especially during the pandemic, I think 2021 will be an important year in the history of this one. We saw quick commerce, Flink, Zap, Gorillas, Getir, those type of companies, GoPuff. Suddenly, consumers in cities are very interested to have food delivered to their door in 15 minutes, groceries delivered to their door in 15 minutes, which is a from a behavioral point of view, very interesting, because when you go into a supermarket, you have time. Well, most of the time you have time.
and people speak for yourself.
Yeah, sorry. My family hates going to the supermarket with me because I take time, because that's my job, to be interested in what's happening in supermarkets. So I spend a lot of time in supermarkets. But people will look at products, they will try and understand them. Whereas when you use quick commerce, it's impulse. I want it now. There's limited choice. People don't care. Click, 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 and have it in their home in 15 minutes. It's a very different type of behavior, which is also for food companies very interesting, because some companies, of course, were moving to how do I sell well in a supermarket? How do I sell well in old-fashioned online? Dare I call it already old-fashioned online? And now you need to come up with a different type of proposition for this quick commerce grocery, which is as I said in the introduction, is going to be an interesting challenge, and not only from a branding and marketing point of view, but also from a supply chain point of view. So. Those are very important changes in behavior that we've seen.
I mean, speaking of the supply chain point of view, I mean, that would also mean again to have, if I understand it correctly, to have more on hand just in case, if we go to that model, right? To conserve food or have quicker routes. How do you see, or where do you see the?
So. As a food producer, you have to deal with more clients and that act in a different way. The story up until a few years ago, of course, was with the growth of e-commerce, again, old-fashioned e-commerce. Ocado in the UK, which is the largest delivery company, grocery delivery company in Europe. They were very different than other retailers because they would send orders to their suppliers every day. So not on a weekly basis. So send me a truck of, I don't know, pasta. No, they would send an order every day because they wanted to keep as little inventory as possible. So that already was a change for food companies. Okay, so for a retailer, I need to have a truck ready that I send every week. And for this online retailer, I need to have a pallet ready because I need to shift every day. And now with quick commerce, it might be different again. And adding to the complexity there is that a growing part of grocery shopping is also direct to consumer. But direct to consumer products, because of the high shipping costs, tend to be specialty, apart from perhaps pet food and larger packed items, but more things that you can't buy in a supermarket. So that's different type of inventory. That is different type of production processes. So it makes the world more complicated. And that's perhaps where technology and IT comes in. And how do you manage all that? How do you manage the inventory? How do you manage those production systems these are 4 channels that I mentioned, to sell into those 4 channels that you see?
Yeah, for sure. Interesting. I mean, I think that's kind of the big view that the consumer doesn't necessarily always have, right? How complicated the supply chain, the food supply chain has gotten, and all the factors that influences, just the ones we've mentioned, like geopolitics, climate, the pandemic, and also just behavior, the way we actually buy and consume our foods, that has an effect all the way up the food supply chain.
95% of the consumers are just not aware of this, and they just go into supermarket. They don't know how products are being made, unless you're a bit of a geek like me and you watch those programs on YouTube and you know how food products are processed. No, most people, they have no clue, and that is fine. But I do believe at one point the awareness of sort of where food comes from and how it is being produced, I think, is important. So.
I mean, you are part of the I guess a move to create more awareness. Maybe, I don't know, your audience of the podcast might be a little bit more specialized of your own podcast. But I think that could be something to look into as well. I mean, an additional challenge to tackle. How do we maybe also raise awareness and have that as a factor?
We as Rabobank are trying to do that in the Netherlands, where we also have retail operations, and are talking to or marketing to our consumers about this, our customers about this. But it's not that easy. And to be honest, most customers or consumers in the supermarket, they don't care. So it's a journey that we're definitely on. In terms of the podcast, my audience is very much corporate. So I do have some bycatch in terms of interested consumers, but in general, it's corporate.
I'd also be interested in, and this may be a little bit beyond your scope, so feel free to tell me if it is, but how do you see this changed consumer behavior that you've now mapped so beautifully? How do you see that impacting plant breeding? So even even earlier in the food supply chain.
Oh, that is an interesting question. There's a few thoughts going through my mind here. So potentially, given that there's more types of channels, you also need more types of products with different shelf lives and all that. So you might have to adjust plant breeding methods to this. But that's I'm not the true expert on this. But given that you just need to have more types of food products, that may happen from here. The second important, interesting, I said important, I'll like to rewind on that. Interesting trend that we're seeing, of course, is vertical farming, which is currently mostly herbs, lettuce, those type of products. But that might advance from here, which needs different types of seeds and different type of products to go there. And we do see a lot of momentum in vertical farming, I must say. With some companies, there's I forgot the name, but there's a big one in Germany. There's Planet Farms in Italy, and there's a few more. And in the US, there's a few very large ones who are now really ready to supply, or are also supplying to retailers. And again, I know a few, and they ask for different types of seeds, and some of them are investing directly because it needs to be optimized the seeds for the environment that the herbs and the lettuce and all that grow in, and so the lighting and whether you use aquaponics or hydroponics. So yes, that's definitely some advancements in that as well. Yeah.
And I mean, we've mentioned your podcast a number of times now. What are the topics, maybe the next topics we can look forward to with the podcast?
So
if you want to share.
No, I'm always happy to share. So the podcast is there's sort of, I have two buckets of topics that I like to think of. What's new, or what is interesting and unknown to the corporate audience that I mentioned before, or what should be top of mind, or what is top of mind and we should discuss. So inflation, I hadn't touched upon up until this year. And then this year I did a podcast on inflation itself, on labor costs, on shipping, because it is top of mind of the audience. And I like to, think with them, basically. And then there's sort of the new or of interesting bucket. So I did a podcast on what's happening in Japanese convenience food. Japan is a very interesting, fascinating food market, and they, in some ways, are very much advanced in how convenience food are being sold. That's the past. So I'm not a real planner in terms of what we're going to do into next year. However, the first one we are going to launch into the next year will be what investors are interested in. So many food companies are listed on stock exchanges, and we are going to discuss, okay, I have a view on what should be interesting to food companies, but investors might have different types of interest, and they are important stakeholders for food companies as well. So that will be the first one into the next year. And I'm pretty sure that we will be talking inflation again next year. And I'm pretty sure that we're talking climate change again into the next year, because those two topics are not going to go away anytime soon. And new ideas come up. So we will definitely present them to the audience.
That's amazing. Maybe as a final question, if you can give us a look, you gave us a look topically into what you have done and are planning to do, but also how you come up with the topics, because you mentioned you have 70, I think, colleagues in the research department. Yeah. That's a lot of people who are really on top of what's happening. How do you actually find your topics, or is there a way for people maybe to bring in specific ideas as well?
Yeah, so that's a great suggestion, by the way. I'm always open to have ideas. So please feel free to reach out to me, and I think the details, you can find my details on LinkedIn, for example. People can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm not able to read all the material that my 70 colleagues produce on a daily basis, but occasionally there's something in there that I just think is fascinating and should be mentioned on the podcast. But creativity is something that is very difficult to channel. So sometimes I just have a light bulb moment, or I have a conversation with someone. I think, hey, this is interesting. Let's do a podcast on it. Let's explore this and let's do a podcast on it. So I'm in that sense. I don't, as I mentioned, I don't like to plan ahead that much. It's just whenever I come across something that is really interesting, I'll bring it forward.
Yeah, and I think we just in this podcast, in this episode, we've seen kind of how broad of a range you have with your interest and with your knowledge. I want to thank you, Cyrille, for taking the time to speak with us, for enlightening us on these major themes, from kind of the hot button topic of food inflation over the shift in consumer behavior to the long-term story of climate change and the reduction of emission. These challenges. I think it was super interesting, and I feel motivated to listen to a few more of your episodes. For everyone out there, the Cyrille's podcast is called Consumer Foods to Go. Cyrille, where can we listen to the podcast?
On most platforms. So it's on our own website, which is rabobank.com, but also on Spotify, on the Apple Podcast app, on Deezer, you name it, you can find it everywhere. Just Google it. You can find it.
Just Google it. Indeed, it's definitely worth a listen. And thank you again for taking the time, Cyrille. To our audience out there, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Computomics podcast as much as I did. Thank you very much for listening. And feel free to check out our other episodes on your podcatcher or on our website, computomics.com. Until next time.